A century ago, Rhondda was growing so fast it didn't have names for all its streets, nor record of all its people. Those citizens needed to be registered to become voters, to elect a council, to influence the social structure of the place, to provide education for the growing army of the young. From the outset, higher goals were not neglected. Rhondda had its secondary schools, its intermediate schools, and nothing speaks more forcefully of the dreams of our Rhondda forebears than their willingness to labour hard for the right to play, for the chance for others to change, and that labour was often done in the knowledge of its physical danger.
Just before 1894, that's going back 100 years, there were many pits being opened in the Rhondda Valley. And I can only suggest one that was the Tynewydd colliery, which is only a matter of 300 yards from where we're standing at the moment. And in 1877 there was the most appalling disaster there, a flood and then fire, an explosion, and there were people trapped and there were lots of accidents with the rescuers, etc. But you know, there wasn't even a hospital or a clinic in the Rhondda at the time that could see to any of the injured people. They had to be cared for at a vestry of a local chapel, which was only a matter of 100-150 yards from the colliery. And they realised then that within a matter of about 3 or 4 years, even after the Tynewydd, there was another disaster up the Rhondda Vach in Anasir, between Anasir and Watstown, and the same position happened, that the miners had to be cared for and then of course taken down to the Cardiff Royal Infirmary. And they realised that there was need for a hospital here in the valleys, and this was the very first hospital to be built in 1894.
Tom Parker, OBE, who lost his sight as a boy, benefited from this early provision of health care and so led a full and rewarding life.
There was no work at all in the valley for any blind person, because you had to be fit. You had to, if you're a man, you worked in a pit. 50,000 in 60 pits. So that there was no job at all. And they called a meeting of the miners, lodged delegates, put the case to them that there was need. A lot of miners had lost their sight in the pits, no jobs for them. They'd had to move to Cardiff or to Swansea. And they agreed to set up the Rhondda Institute for the Blind, have a penny a week deducted from their pay, in 1919. And by 1923 they had opened a 3-storey factory employing 70 blind people in Llwynapia. The man who worked, he was covered for medical purposes by his national insurance contribution. But then they had a system known as poundage. They would pay 3p in the pound to the local doctor or the doctor's service, and that would provide free medical treatment for the whole of his family, his wife and children. So that if you were ill, you didn't have to pay anything, because the money went in while you worked. And that's why Nye Bevan always said he believed the health service should be such that you paid when you worked and you didn't pay when you couldn't. And that was the whole of the Rhondda was built up like that.
Neither the body nor the soul of the Rhondda was neglected.
By 1860, there were only 7 chapels serving the whole of the community. But by 1892, in the 30 years between 1860 and 1892, it grew from 7 to 112 chapels. And by 1905, the year of the revival, there were 151 chapels in the Rhondda, and according to a report of the time, there was a seating capacity of 85,105. So you can see the strength of nonconformity at that time.
And that strength made the chapels a focus for social and cultural life.
There was something going on in every chapel practically every night of the week. The village life more or less rotated around the chapel at that time. There was prayer meeting, sisterhood, Sayet or Gyfaillach, discussion groups, as you would say, and Band of Hope.
We had to go to Band of Hope and chapel on a Sunday 3 times a day. On a Sunday. Then there was no going for a walk after chapel. On your own, you had to go with your mother and father. And that was only up to see somebody's gardens, lotments. My father was working on the railway, and he started work at 17, and you had to be a member of the chapel before you could have a job there on the railway. And all the big seats, as we used to call it, they were all drivers and firemen that were in the big seat. I can always remember that. And nearly all the shopkeepers in Turbot used to go to that chapel because they thought they were somebody.
Every chapel was allocated a month in the chapel, in the hall, and they either put on a play or a cantata, and of course the cantatas were the product of the Band of Hope. There was no other attractions more or less in Mardy, only the pictures. Not very many people went to pictures at that time, but everything went around the chapel.
But there were other consolations in this confined world. There were public houses, some hotels with palatial pretension, others just drinking dens, and they slaked another kind of thirst. The socially conscious, buoyed up by Victorian respectability and Welsh Sabbatarian teetotalism, strove to offer to colliers an alternative to outright prohibition. Coffee shops, temperance bars and soft-flavoured drinks, cherryade, American cream soda and apple crush brewed for sweetness rather than strength. The Welsh hills, in William Evans's effervescent mind, were to be alive with the sound of pop.
William Evans, at the early age of 21, was the owner of a shop in Hannah Street in Porth. And one might have assumed that this would have been the height of a young man's ambitions. But not so William Evans. William Evans had dreams, and dreams which were not to be fulfilled without some kind of stimulus. And it was said that on one occasion, he was standing behind his counter in Hannah Street, Porth, when the most unlikely visitor appeared in Hannah Street. We today would be familiar with the sort of person. We'd have seen him on television, dressed as a cowboy from Galveston. It was said that he had left Galveston at pistol point. He had a dubious past. He was reckoned to be one of the early frontier medicine men, selling an Indian remedy which was a cure for all complaints. And he fired William Evans with enthusiasm for the idea of manufacturing mineral waters or pop. Well, the original name which William Evans chose for his soft drinks was Welsh Hills. And undoubtedly he was influenced by possibly 2 arguments. Number one, that the industry had started in the Welsh Hills, both in the Rhondda here, and also by the fact that the Welsh Hills water would convey the impression of purity. But when business expanded, when the factories began springing up all over England as well, it seemed then, when and there were 187 of them, that the name of Welsh Hills was inappropriate. So he held a competition in order to decide on what the new name of his drink should be. And it appears that, possibly influenced by the fact that the crown is the top, that he chose the title Corona. And of course Corona drinks they've been ever since. And Corona is associated with the tremendous expansion of the William Evans empire. The logo was often presented as a crown made up of bottles of different colours of pop.
The pop man's weekly visit around the streets was eagerly anticipated, a little fizz for when times were harder. And the swing from prosperity and expectation could be sudden. In 1910, the very name of Tonypandy became infamous, associated with riot and mayhem, as a strike of the 12,000 colliers in the Cambrian Combine spilled over the limits of industrial relations, brought imported police and troops to the streets of Mid-Rhondda for over a 12-month, and all at the behest of the then Liberal Home Secretary Winston Churchill. The Tonypandy riots signal above all else that consensus and moderation in politics and industrial relations was at an end for liberal Edwardian Wales. An era was drawing to a close then, even if it was not obvious at the time. The First World War initially brought the coal industry and the numbers working in it in the Rhondda to a heightened pitch. And during that war, the tank that rumbled through Rhondda with the unlikely name of Egbert collected for the war effort. But it was a war that claimed Rhondda lives by the score, as indifferently as any underground explosion. What the soldiers returned to seemed, at first sight, to be a world of work resumed. It was an illusion. But for a while, in the early 1920s, the pattern was repeated. Collier boys followed in their father's footsteps down the pit.